Hello and welcome to today's Insight event. Today we're looking particularly at the data from Q1 2021, which of course is going to highlight some of the many issues faced by young people in light of the COVID pandemic. GetMyFirstJob and the Talent People are very clearly focused on addressing the issues, specifically those faced by young people, and our vision speaks very clearly to this. Our vision is a world where young people from every background are inspired to connect with insight, development and employers which are right for them. Some of the data that we're looking at today speaks very much to the challenges associated with this vision. To help us understand what's going on, we consider data from a wide range of different sources. We'll look at macro data, including unemployment data such as claimant counts. We consider NEET stats, as well as data from the National Apprenticeship Service, labour market information and other sources. We take this macro data and then compare it with a range of other internal data sets. For example, the data and candidate profiles that we collect from those we work with. And as well as basic demographic data, we also cross-match this with social economic status, ethnicity, and so on. And we also then align that to the behaviour we see online. So the difference between, for example, stated career preferences and then the roles that individuals go on and apply to. Our total data set since founding the business in 2014 now runs to over 600,000 young people. And so the longitudinal data sets allow us to look at what's happened over time to identify those trends. So to begin with, let's take a look at the national overview and see exactly what is going on. To help frame our review, we're really going to focus in on three different elements today. The first is unemployment and the impact of the furlough scheme. The second is the availability of apprenticeship opportunities. And then the third is the nature of those different opportunities which are available. So let's turn first of all to the claimant count. Now it's worthwhile recognising that young people's unemployment levels in the UK have been at incredibly low levels for a long period of time, far lower than those seen in other continental European countries, for example. And when we look back at this data set, we do see this very low trend of under 200,000 young people being on the claimant count. But then there's an incredibly fast and significant growth between March and May last year. Whilst we could go back as far as Jan 2019 and see lows of 187,000, the NEET level and unemployment levels were rising. So by Jan 2020, we'd seen that raise to about 226,000, but that then more than doubles in just 60 days, going up to 530,000 by the mid part of last year. When we looked at the pandemic and the potential impact on young people, it was very clear early on that they were going to be affected far more than other groups, simply because of the nature of the employment, but also the way in which employers tend to behave when it comes to a recession. We looked back at the data sets from the previous recessions, and our internal working forecast was that we'd see around 1.3 million unemployed. Now, at face value, we can see that actually that number has not been achieved, and that's fantastic. However, when you include the furlough data on top, we see that actually the impact on young people has been even more significant than we had expected, peaking well over 1.5 million in July 2020. The other thing to note is it's a very dynamic situation. So whilst we have seen this incredible spike, you can see very clearly from the data here the changing role of employment based on the level of lockdown in the country. And as lockdown was eased after the initial period, we see young people being returned to work from furlough, but then a very sharp increase again towards the back end of last year. And we expect that, of course, to have continued across Q1. So the first thing to recognise is that for young people, the last year has been incredible. They've been massively impacted at a level that probably was not anticipated by any forecast. The nature of the jobs which they carry out, particularly entry-level roles in areas such as retail and hospitality, have simply vanished. And so there is now a group of young people for whom work has not been possible. And that sets about, I think, some of the challenges that we'll face as we look into the next 9 to 12 months, as we try and engage young people and bring them into the workforce. So if that's what was going on in terms of unemployment levels, let's take a look at the opportunities that did exist through the apprenticeship programme. Now, as many of you will know, the number of opportunities for young people has declined significantly in the last few years. Prior to the apprenticeship levy, far higher numbers of opportunities were in existence, but I think we had certainly noticed that in 2019 there was a bit more of a trend and stabilisation in the apprenticeship programme. So if we look back to 2019, over 130,000 opportunities were advertised via the National Apprenticeship website. The impact of the pandemic, though, is very clear to see. And when we overlay data from last year, that's 2020, you can see the significant gap that is apparent, that opens up during the year, so that we see this huge decline from 130,000 vacancies in 2019 to just 85,000 by the end of last year. So again, for young people making the progression into the workforce, the kind of routes that we would expect young people to take into the workforce have obviously had a significant impact. That's not surprising given the nature of the lockdown, but it's still a challenge that will need to be overcome. And as we look at the latest data, we see that that trend has in fact not improved. Again, not surprisingly, because of lockdown, numbers are down another 20% across the first quarter of 2021. We'll be monitoring this data closely, and obviously in our next update, we would expect to see a significant increase. The anecdotal evidence from the customers that we work most closely with shows that in areas such as hospitality, for example, there has already been a significant increase in the range of opportunities in April this year. So if that's the number of opportunities, it's also worthwhile reflecting on the types of opportunities that there are available. This is some analysis that shows the apprenticeship opportunities by level immediately before the pandemic and then immediately afterwards. Now, what is apparent is a change in the mix, a significant reduction in terms of intermediate, advanced apprenticeships, and a pro rata increase in the number of higher and degree apprenticeships. What these pie charts probably don't show, though, is the collapse in those opportunities. So, for example, we see opportunities in terms of intermediate vacancies dropping from 16,000 to 3,500, and on advanced from 12,250 to 3,500. Those are the types of opportunities that obviously are typically accessed by school leavers, and so again we see this focus that is incredibly negative for school leavers, really reducing the opportunities that there are out there for them. Degree apprenticeships actually grew as a percentage of total opportunities, and the decline from 990 to 750 is relatively small in comparison to other declines that are seen in other types of apprenticeships. So there has been a massive impact on unemployment, including and probably more specifically the furlough scheme. The hope has to be, of course, that as we return to a more normal way of working, the furlough will have protected jobs and we'll see a very rapid reduction in those unemployment figures. The second point then is this significant reduction in opportunities. Not surprisingly, because of the pandemic, the number of roles out there has gone down. But again, helping young people make the transition into the workforce means that we'll need to help communicate all those opportunities, and the matching between young people and opportunities is going to become incredibly important in the next few months to get people back into work quickly and stop the habits that quite often get associated with worklessness. The final element then is to understand the impact of this huge reduction of intermediate and advanced opportunities. It's highly likely that those opportunities which are most closely associated with school leavers are going to have the biggest impact on that group at the very start of their working life. So understanding how that is going to change as we see hospitality, retail opening up again, and understanding how we can help young people take very valuable first steps in those particular sectors is going to be vital. So if that's the overview of the economy when it comes to jobs, let's understand a bit more about the candidate's perspective. We run a survey on a quarterly basis to our candidates, typically getting 3,000 to 4,000 respondents across a quarter. from a sample of 15 or 20,000. So it's a fairly statistically significant group, and it tells us some interesting facts about the life of candidates in the current environment. So to help put some structure into this, we're going to share just a few of the questions that we look at to understand what's going on. We'll talk a little bit about the sources of careers advice and where the advice is coming from. And then take a bit of a look at the way in which young people are making decisions. So what is important to them? And we have a measure which we call candidate confidence, and we can track over time the impact of the pandemic on young people's confidence in their career choices and next steps. So let's begin by looking at the sources of advice. There's always been an interesting relationship between formal advice given through, for example, careers advisors and teachers, and the advice that young people gain from parents, guardians and others. And if you go back to Q1 2020, then we're seeing, I guess, a fairly stable pattern where although careers advisors were very important, they were outstripped by other sources of information. What we can see since the pandemic kicked in is actually a significant reduction in young people's reliance on careers advisors and teachers. Now, this isn't really that unexpected. Schools have had an incredibly challenging time, and any of you that work with schools will recognise the patterns where they've had challenges that are as varied as teaching in bubbles, moving to online learning, challenges to do with assessment techniques. It has been really incredible and unprecedented for the lives of teachers. And as a result, quite often careers advice and time for careers advice, as well as the actual interventions with employers, have suffered, and again, not surprisingly given the environment. However, what we can also then recognise is that young people have turned increasingly to parents, guardians and siblings for that advice. So in a world where they've had to find it elsewhere, young people have adapted, which is to be recognised. For those organisations, though, that are involved with recruiting and giving advice to young people, it is worth noting the significant role of advisors, of informal advisors. So when thinking about careers campaigns, about outreach, making sure that parents and guardians are part of that strategy is really important. Now, it's not been an easy time for young people, and some of the verbatim feedbacks that we've had really does highlight the way that it has an impact on them, with many concerns about finding jobs, about stress and anxiety, not knowing what to do, about uncertainty. And in many cases, candidates tell us that they're just confused as to whether or not it's worthwhile applying for jobs. When we dig into the data, though, we can see that there are various trends that really do stand out. So what we're looking at now is the way in which young people perceive that their schools have prepared them for making informed decisions about careers. And what we see is that across pre and post-pandemic measurements, across pre and post-pandemic measurements, there really is an intriguing pattern. And so we're almost seeing two extremes of the spectrum here. Those schools that have probably dealt well with the pandemic, that have made the effective switch to online learning, where pupils have had access to the IT that is required for those interventions. And at the other end, the digital divide highlighting those individuals who have not been able to access that same level of advice. So again, if we're thinking about career choices, it's important to understand that there are now more young people who have not had access to a good or reasonable careers advice through the school system. And that will have an impact on the advice that needs to be delivered to them as part of any attraction or recruitment campaign. One of the other areas that we have measured over a long period of time is understanding what young people believe is important when they're applying for jobs. And whilst salary is often talked about, and in fact it's number 4 on the list, young people have for a long time been looking at far more sophisticated indicators such as career development or the practicalities of how they get to work, or even the purpose of the organisation that is recruiting them. And in fact, evidence that we saw prior to the pandemic suggested that this was a growing focus, that young people were far more interested in the company they're going to work for and the ability to make a difference than salary itself. And as we look at what's happened post-pandemic, so comparing the data now with Q1 in 2021, in fact, it is this company with good purpose that has now jumped to the top of the board. Now, that has a significant impact in terms of the practicalities of attraction and recruitment campaigns. Whilst a clear description of any roles that are on offer is obviously very important, competitive salary is obviously very important, ensuring that a lot of thought goes into describing the way in which your organisation has purpose and that the role of any candidates in contributing to that purpose, that really does stand out at the top. We'll be publishing research shortly, which we've conducted with Nesta, looking at just one area of this, and that's to do with the role of green jobs. We believe that there will be significant investment from the government in the coming months as the Build Back campaign takes off, with a focus on green and building back in the green environment. So the way in which organisations communicate their alignment to that particular mission, we believe, is going to be important. And of course, it's not just a mission that has an impact on construction. If we look at issues such as coding, for example, where the creation of scripts to use minimal power in data centres comes up, there is virtually no job at all where the green agenda does not have a significant role to play. So we'll be monitoring this closely and sharing it with you. But again, these are the things that we know young people are looking at and therefore need to be communicated as part of any attraction or engagement strategy. Finally, the most interesting measure for us is this one around confidence. So we use a net confidence figure, and it's focused on the steps that will be taken by young people. What this graph shows very clearly is the impact of the pandemic, where there is over a 10% drop in net confidence from over 25% to around 12.5% in Q2 2020. But young people are resilient. We've all had to be resilient. And we can see that confidence growing into Q1 2021, where we're now back over the 20% again. So again, we'll be monitoring this and sharing this data. But it is fair to say that despite the many challenges, overall, young people's confidence does appear to be returning in the jobs market, and they understand the steps that will be required for them to enter into their desired career. When we ask candidates about what they think about employers, we get some really interesting insights. Many of the verbatims come back to really talk about the way that young people don't believe that they are either understood or valued. So, for example, communicating that employers recognise that A-level exams have not really operated as would be expected, and that we're going to have another year of disruption. So we speak to many employers who tell us they're trying to come up with alternatives to A-levels as a way of assessing young people as they go into a selection process, but making sure that message gets out to young people, that they can have the confidence to know that they're not being limited by a process which they may feel hasn't been fair to them. The other point that comes across a lot is around providing information. So transparency of the process and making sure that it is described online in other materials so that the young people can understand what's going to happen to them, what their process will be, how their application will be handled. And then one of the other points that does come back is very much around pay. And we notice a real significant discrepancy between some organisations which appear to focus very much on paying the least possible for a young person in a role and appear to have the perspective that a young person is lucky to get anything. Whereas at the other end, we see there is significant competition with salaries of around the £20,000 mark for school leavers not being uncommon in large organisations where performance is a real key focus. One of my favourite comments that came back from a candidate this quarter was, stop looking for Prince Charming, but offering court jester pay. So being realistic about what others are paying to attract really good candidates is really important in the current environment. It may be competitive in that there may be far too few opportunities and far too many candidates, but recognise that the best candidates still have great choice. So as a summary, I think we all need to understand and recognise that there has been a change in the prioritisation of structured careers advice in schools. And it's going to take some time for that careers advice to get back to the position it was in just a year ago. Many schools have been responding incredibly positively to the benchmarking and the benchmarks that come from the Careers and Enterprise Company with employer encounters and experiences. But the realities of this academic year are that many organisations are not going to be able to offer the kind of work experience that schools would normally engage in. We believe there's also a significant discrepancy between the way in which the world of work has moved on at pace, where hybrid working is now the norm, where if roles can be carried out from home, they will be. And we believe there's a long-term shift. So we're unlikely to go back to the full-time office-based roles that many schools relied on for work experience. I think there's a fundamental challenge about how do you give young people experience of the world of work when most of us will be working at home if we can for the foreseeable future. The second point then is recognising that young people are looking for sources. Where careers advice in schools has unfortunately been limited, they are reliant on others around them, they're reliant on online sources to making sure that your data and information is available is important. The third point then is recognising the increased focus on values. So what is it that your organisation does and how is a young person going to help contribute to that? And then finally, confidence is returning. So young people are beginning to recognise now that there is going to be a world after the pandemic, and they're beginning to look at those options and growing confidence about what they need to do. The final element we want to touch on briefly for today's briefing is around some of the social and long-term trends. So outside the immediate challenges of the pandemic, we've identified a number of factors which we believe are going to be important as the UK struggles with some of the issues around underlying productivity that we were all talking about prior to the pandemic. So two areas just to highlight here. Thinking particularly around the dynamic nature of careers and skills, not only in the UK but around the world. And secondly, taking a very brief look at social mobility. When we think about careers and skills in the longer term, we increasingly look at a model that was highlighted originally by the World Economic Forum, which talks about high-tech and high-touch roles. In other words, coders and carers. And certainly the World Economic Forum and a lot of other analysis conducted by organisations such as the RSA highlights that in a world where automation and the fourth industrial revolution is increasingly taking hold, there are some areas of working life where automation is unlikely to replace people. So whether it is coders, software developers, systems engineers as the high-tech end of the spectrum, or whether it's carers, teachers, nurses, chefs, where that human interaction is so important, those areas are likely to be sustainable in the long term and show growth in terms of the demand for young people. Occupations where it is likely there's going to be more significant automation include areas such as accountancy, retail, warehousing and so on. Now, understanding this model at this stage is very important because we're talking about long-term career choices. In other words, this is not just about the job you apply for today, it's about the job that is likely to give you a fulfilling career over the coming years. One of the observations that I think has been made is that COVID-19 has accelerated some of those underlying trends. And certainly we've seen a massive increase in the relation of high-tech roles in comparison to the touch or the automation roles over the last 12 months, to the factor of about 350%. What is interesting is that the high-touch roles have not really grown at the same rate. We believe this to be largely a function of lockdown, and we're expecting across Q2 for those opportunities to increase rapidly as well. The automation roles, however, are fairly flat, but again, it's worthwhile understanding a bit more behind that to say why those roles exist, I suppose, and also who is applying to them. When we overload this data with factors such as social economic status, other patterns become clear. One of the things that we've monitored for some time has been the number of applications made by young people dependent on their social economic status. So this graph is showing us that pre-pandemic there was a fairly straight correlation that says the lower your social economic status, the less roles you would apply for. When we look post-pandemic and we look at the blue line, we can see that the average number of applications that's been made by young people has actually increased over that period pre and post-pandemic. But again, what we're seeing is an increased divergence between polar quintile 1, so the low social economic status, and those at the higher end of the spectrum. So the more socially mobile you are, then the likelihood is the more well equipped you will be for search and the more active you will be. And that has a major impact on those organisations that are wanting to address social mobility, because it means that as a recruiting organisation, whether you're an employer or a training provider, you'll have to work harder to get to those candidates from the lower social economic status groups. Simply advertising and hoping that you are going to get applicants from all groups is unlikely to deliver the right result for you or the right result in terms of social mobility. And we also believe there's a more fundamental trend as well. So when we look at where those applications are going in terms of the sectors, what we have here is a graph that maps it out. And we can see that in areas such as warehousing, this has been a persistent trend which we've spoken about on other occasions. Careers such as warehousing continue to get over 50% of applications from the two lowest quintiles in terms of social mobility, whereas areas such as social media or teaching are very much dominated by the higher social economic status. In other words, the career choices being made today, which will have an impact on people's careers for the next 5 to 10 years, we can see a polarisation based almost exclusively on social economic status. That does not speak to the fact that we are closing the social mobility gap. If anything, not only does it mean in the short term, because of salary and wages, we're going to see an increase in the challenges of social mobility, but it means in the longer term, we're also going to see a reduction in social mobility, because people from the lower social economic status backgrounds are not moving into or not choosing careers which are likely to be sustainable throughout the fourth industrial revolution. So as a summary, understanding that careers are dynamic, skills are dynamic, and we need to be looking 5-10 years out to understand the nature of high-tech and high-touch careers if we're involved in any way with advising young people is so important. Also recognising that social mobility is a direct influence on the types of careers and the activity of young people when it comes to career selection. So making a determined effort and making positive action to address these structural inequalities and underrepresentation is so important, particularly at this time when so many young people do not have access to the types of career networks and support networks that they would otherwise see. So thank you very much indeed for joining me for this quarterly insight. We'll be running our next update in 3 months' time. So look forward to talking to you then, if not before. And if you would like any more information about any of the data that you've seen today, please get in touch with us at GetMyFirstJob or the Talent People, and we'll be delighted to provide further insights, either about specific industries, sectors, or your organisation. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.